Broadcasting live from the Subaru of Gwinnett Studios in Atlanta, it's time for On the Money, presented by Embassy National Bank. Now, here's your host, Joe Moss.
Hi, everybody. This is Joe Moss at Embassy National Bank, and welcome to this week's edition to On the Money, the #1 small business podcast on Business Radio X. I should say Happy New Year to everyone. We are starting off a new year, and hopefully this year will be bigger and better for everybody than last year. At the bank, we see things starting to happen and everybody moving forward with their businesses, so hopefully this year will be better. This show is sponsored by Embassy National Bank. We're discussing topics designed to help small business succeed, and Embassy is proud of how we help small business. Welcome to the global broadcast studios of Subaru of Gwinnett, a great facility and a great team here. So off to a new year. This year, today we're going to talk about debt collection, and we have Dawn Poplawski from PCC Innovative Solutions, and she helps companies with collecting debt, correct?
That is correct.
All right. So why don't you kind of tell us what you do, what your company does, what some of your specialties are, and that type of thing.
Sure thing. Yes, PCC Innovative Solutions, that was a company that I started just almost having a year anniversary, first year. And what we basically do is everything from not only your debt collections of for your over 90, over 120 days bad debt. We also offer to companies accounts receivable outsourcing. So there's a lot of companies that don't have the staff, and it's also better for them as far as the overhead. So they just outsource their accounts receivables to us. And that's not a matter of where we purchase them. We just basically represent that we are a member of that company or we're partnered with that company to help manage their receivables.
So do you do the automated piece of it or just the call and try to collect piece of that?
Just the call and collect.
Okay.
They will do the invoicing, and for instance, I have one client that I VPN in on, and that way I can pull up the receivables and keep track of the invoices as they age.
Okay.
And contact them that way. And go ahead.
Who is your target client? Who do you do a lot of your best work for?
Well, my target is more on the construction and supplier. At least that's my experience. I've got over 20 years dealing with the construction industry as far as both manufacturers, suppliers, and general contractors. Mm-hmm. And so because I am so familiar with all the lien laws and the requirements, that's one of my main focuses.
Okay.
But most of what actually comes to me, they seem to seek me out, as I'm getting a lot of property management companies that are having issues, too, because of the economy. And so there's a lot of consumer debt. So I handle both the commercial and the consumer debt.
So on the construction side, then you would work with a contractor who has done work for somebody else and has trouble getting paid.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
And what are some of the techniques that you use in terms of, let's assume that before we get into best practices to avoid having to be in this position, what type of procedures are in place for you to be able to go collect?
Right. Yeah. Like most collection agencies, we do start with your contact initially by phone. As an agency, you are also required to send out a correspondence within 5 days. Mm-hmm. So we take that simple approach, just basically first trying to find out what the situation is. Whether it's business that we're dealing with or a consumer, we try to find out what that situation is before we go to more extreme measures of collecting. Because number one, the one thing I try to focus on is I try to be more of a mediator between the client and that debtor. Because there's a lot of issues sometimes that it may just be a simple dispute or misunderstanding or, I've actually had some that just don't want to deal with that person. But
Okay.
they'll pay, if they're dealing with somebody else outside of that. So, I basically will go with the, same tactics in the beginning. But, if it gets to the point where they're not responding and, they have no intentions of paying, you try to set up payment plans. And if they basically ignore that issue, then I do advise my client to go ahead and take them to court, which I handle for them as well.
Okay. And once you get them in court, you have the, if you're a contractor, I guess under Georgia law, you have the ability to lien the job,
Yes.
don't you?
Yes.
Okay. And lien the job means what?
Basically, what liening the property, but in Georgia too, if the contractor basically has 90 days in order to do that, they have to send notification to the owner as well as the contractor. But if that's not done, they can lose their lien rights. But what it does is it basically will put a lien on that property, so the property cannot be sold unless the lien is satisfied. So,
They got to get paid when they get sold.
Yes.
So as a lender, a lot of times that's what we check, because the mechanic lien actually can come in front of the loan as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they're very well protected once you get to that point. Has the electronic world changed what you do at all? How has that affected you? All the electronic payments, credit cards, that type of thing. Has that affected what you do at all, or is it everybody still dealing with checks and bills?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Actually, it seems to have made life a lot easier. Because I could tell you 30 years ago, in order for me to file a lien, I used to have to go to the courthouse, pull the tax records, find out who owned the property. And basically, you had to do the step-by-step process and then file it internally. Now you have electronic e-filing, and all that information is public. It's on the internet. So a lot of it actually simplifies what we do.
But on the actual, there are multiple ways to make the payment.
Yes.
I guess but instead of sending out bills, are people still sending out bills? Are they doing that electronically? Is that facilitated anything that you do? Has that cut into your business at all, or is it still the same?
A lot of that's still the same, especially with the smaller businesses. They're handling things the old-fashioned way. There's still a lot of paper invoices. And it's not, what's unfortunate, I'm finding a lot of them, they don't have utilized contracts and things like that. It's just a matter of an invoice. So there's a lot of things that they could, kind of upgrade and get a little bit more with the times. But I know too, it depends on what's cost effective for them.
Okay.
And their size of business. But there are a lot that utilize the online, payment with credit cards and things like that.
Okay.
Because I also have that on my website.
But someone still has to agree to make the payment before any of that starts to happen. So that's at least you don't have to get in the business of recovering bad checks or anything like that, unless you do.
I do.
Okay.
Yes. I've actually had to, a few months back, I had a warrant filed.
Okay.
And actually the only way I could get her to satisfy it was once she was arrested, her attorney contacted me to settle the debt so they could basically
Because it's
clear
still
that.
illegal in the state of Georgia
Yes,
to
it
write a
is.
bad check, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And most of us don't. I committed a cardinal rule, everybody, not turning my phone off. So hold on. I apologize for that. So you also do it on the consumer side. So you said you work with some property management companies. What other kind of consumer debt do you try to collect?
Oh, I've gotten everything from the pest control services, cleaning services. I've gotten veterinarian service, vision doctor's office. So yeah, I mean it doesn't. It's a wide range of variety.
Doctors, and what about medical receivables at all?
Yeah, I've actually have a chiropractor as well, and a lot of that issue is where there's some instances where the insurance companies or the attorneys for these auto accidents are paying the patient directly, and they're assuming that patient's going to, take care of the doctor, the provider.
But they don't.
But that doesn't always happen.
Right, and the medical collections have gotten so complicated because the bills seem to adjust every time that you get another bill from the hospital or whoever. So, pretty interesting. All right, so let's talk about best practices. If take the chiropractor, for example. Give me an idea of some of the counseling that you provide them or help that you provide to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen.
Okay.
What do you advise them to do?
Well, for the most part, there is a rule for them to, of course, they file everything, especially most of their situations are dealt with the auto accidents. So there is a form. It's like an authorization. So that's one thing that they really need to utilize, because what that does is that goes to the patient. And that patient, if they sign that form, then that's basically what they can use in place for the attorney and the insurance provider or the insurance company, that provider has to be paid directly. And so that way those funds do not go through the patient first. But there's things like that they just never, it's a good old boy, and so there's a lot of times where they trust these people are going to just handle it and pay their debts. When they sign that authorization, aren't they also agreeing to pay for it personally? I mean, aren't they? Yes, well, they do that anyway. Okay. I mean, that's a different form. When you go to the medical doctor, you're always signing the form saying that if your insurance company does not pay for some reason, you are responsible. Right. And a lot of them, they still fight that. They're like, basically, they're like, my insurance company should have paid that. And it's like, well, we can try to go to your insurance company, but if they tell us no, that's so will you do that? Do you get in and try to help and go after the insurance company on behalf of the chiropractor, or do you leave that for the consumer to do? Well, yeah, I leave that for the consumer and the provider. Okay. Because when they give me the account, the provider's already dealt with the insurance company, and they basically get a statement from the insurance company saying that this is what they're going to pay and this is what they have paid. So there's really no further involvement. Well, we're talking about debt collection today, and as a banker, it's kind of near and dear to my heart since I've done a little bit of it. But we're talking with Dawn Poplawski, and she is with PCC Innovative Solutions, and she's talking about some of the clients that she deals with and some of the issues that she comes up with. I've also often heard from subcontractors that they have a lot of difficulty getting paid from the contractor. So what are some of the steps that a subcontractor can take to avoid having to go collect the money? Okay. Well, that also, the liens rights also apply for them. Right. So right. That is one thing that they can do. But no one wants to get in a situation where they have to use you to start with, though. And things like that, they don't need to use me. Right. That is one thing that I try to get a lot of these contractors to just put in their policy. Right. A lot of them are afraid that their clients might get upset if they go and, do a notice to lien. And, the way I tell them is like, if you want to compete with the big boys, which, a lot of them would like to work up that way, that is something they need to just kind of go ahead and start putting in their regular routine. And their clients will begin to understand that this is just the way they do business. It's nothing personal. It's nothing against them. It's just something to help cover, just like anything else you would do with insurance but anyway, so that's one thing that I try to get them to do and utilize and put in their policy. And to file, a claim of lien, it's $25. You don't, it's right. The only time you would look for an attorney is when you need to perfect the lien, and you have a year to do that. So typically I've never had to pursue the actual lien itself because, it's going to get paid within that year's time. Right. Now, can subcontractors demand payment upon completion of the work, and how often does that happen? And is that a practice that's a workable practice? Yeah, it's more complicated when it comes to the contractors because it depends on the job. When it comes to the construction industry, there's a lot of, depending on who you're dealing with, whether it be a municipality, it could be a bonded job. There's different laws that go with each type, of construction project. And so it's really kind of, you can't just tell them, subcontractors that this is what you can do. It really depends on what the stipulation is in the contract, because you've also got some that, require retainage or will hold a percentage once the job not only is completed, but, okay, for instance, once it's completed, but their portion could have been completed 6 months ago.
Okay.
But they're not going to get paid until that job's complete. So really, to answer your question, it kind of depends on the contract itself.
So a contractor really needs to understand and feel good about the contractor, and at the same time make sure they understand the contract between themselves and the contractor, but also should they try to look into the contract between the contractor and the actual person that they're doing the work for? Or is that something, do they have a right to see that?
Well, yeah, typically it's the same, type of contract. It's whatever guidelines are on that project. The general contractor typically will follow that down. But it's funny that you were talking about that because I've run into subcontractors that are like getting frustrated dealing with the general contractors. And they want to just become one themselves and not have to deal with the middleman, because that is a lot of times where you get your issue, because if they're not getting paid for something, they tried to hold that against paying the subcontractor.
Well, right. And we hear
but it doesn't work. That's not right.
We hear a lot.
Yeah.
And so we hear that subcontractors, they pick and choose the contract. They do a little upfront research on the contractor before they'll take the job, and get to know their contractor before they actually start putting their people on the job to get the work done.
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea.
So other than let's see, property managers, contractors, what other industries are you involved with?
Pretty much those are the majority. Like
Okay.
I said, with the medical, medical consumer, it's B2B, B2C. So pretty much all of that type of thing. But again, I'm working mostly with the smaller and middle, because the main thing that I try to do with them is educate. I'm not out there. I didn't start the business to just be a debt collector. I'm trying to get around to educating them on what they need to do to, prevent those bad debt collections from even occurring.
Okay. Give us some examples of some major common mistakes that you see being made that you try to advise against.
Okay. One of the main ones is basically dealing with someone you don't check out. Even the property management companies, typically they will run some type of, credit background check. And I've actually seen some of them that are run. And I get really surprised that they even, deal with them, because
Right.
then I'm looking at them and I'm like, okay, they have judgments and liens and you're renting to them. But a lot of these companies that if they extend terms at all, even if they do a 50 up front and a 50 upon completion, the balance, a lot of times they're still not checking them either. And, that's one thing that I recommend to them, especially if you're doing a large dollar amount or if you don't know these people, put it in your contract that you will be doing a credit check on them and have them approve it, because that's the only way you can really see how they manage their money and their business. And so that's the main thing.
Well,
is
when
to
you
check
do
it out.
when you do the contract with that person that you're going to be trying to collect from, or that's doing the work, and you're going to be trying to collect from them, I would get something signed up front that allows you to pull credit, and then and go ahead and make that contract almost a promissory note so that you go collect against that. And it may not be such a bad idea to potentially get a prepayment, maybe a bond if you don't like the credit that comes back. So.
Yeah, companies have a lot of, there is a lot of different things that they can do to help protect themselves. And that's one thing I try. And it's different with the industry, of course.
And you have a company has a right to have terms as
Yes.
well as an interest rate, as well as default rates if they don't get paid. Because at that point, they are a lender and a lender to typically another business, and they have a right to all types of financial damages that they can collect as a note on a note.
Yes.
Do you advise people to? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
So
I was going to say I just did one recently, and it was basically a law firm, and within their contract they didn't stipulate anything. It was basically, okay, this is the payment plan that we're agreeing to sitting down at that time. But there's nothing in there as far as, like you say, running any type of credit background. There's nothing in there as far as any late fees or collecting interest. And so that's what I had produced for them is I took their contract and just basically added a whole page of terms and conditions that should be in there.
So you had to do that for an attorney.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
Well, yeah. Not every, attorneys specialize in their thing.
The cobbler's children has no shoes, right? So,
yeah.
So what are some of the most avoidable things that you see happen among your clients?
Avoidable things?
Yeah, like not getting it in writing.
Okay.
Examples like
contracts, number one. Like I
get
said.
it in writing.
Yes, get it in writing, and make sure, number one, you know who you're doing business with. This is something else that I've come across, and because going after them even legally, down the road, if that happens, you can have just a matter of someone that comes in representing a business, and yet the retailer is putting something in their personal name rather than the business's name. So there's little things like that you have to really be careful about what you're doing and who you're selling to. Because when it comes a legal issue, there's a matter of who you're taking to court.
Right.
So
right.
there's things like that I try to educate them once I see things that they're doing, and try to stress that, you need to, there's certain questions that you need to ask regardless. Certain information that you need to obtain regardless of who you're doing business with.
Well,
and again, that kind of goes with the upfront policies. Have standards that you follow, so that way it'll protect yourself.
We have something in banking that we call KYC, or Know Your Customer. And I think that is as important in the small business world as it is in banking. We have to do it for anti-money laundering and making sure we're not dealing with criminals and tax evaders and things like that. But I think any small business needs to have a Know Your Customer policy in place and check mark some of the things that you want to find out about your customer. So perhaps a utilization of a form up front that would indicate all those things that you can go back and check. For example, not just credit checks, but Facebook pages, Yelp, customer complaints. Look at Google under who you're doing business with and find out if they're reputable people.
I utilize those to track them down.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, everybody leaves a digital thumbprint.
Oh, yeah.
Footprint.
I do.
And then realize that if you're doing work for somebody, that you've created a promissory note. And it's something you said kind of triggered it. If you're doing work for a business, you need to get the business to sign, but you need to get the owners to personally guarantee that work too, so that if something does happen, you can go after the business and you can go after that individual personally.
Yes.
And
That's true.
Do credit checks on the business as well as the individual. The business could have multiple defaults out there or judgments against it, and a lot of people are very clever in terms of how to avoid paying judgments, because even though you may try to collect something and you get a judgment, it doesn't mean that they still have to pay. You have to go try to collect on the judgment. So it can be pretty tricky.
Yeah. And to add to what you're saying there, a lot of these companies, they'll have sister companies.
Sure.
So, if you don't run a credit check on the business and get that information, who you're dealing with, that company may go out or may go under, bankrupt, but then everything is passed over to that other company. So, of course, you're not doing business with that company. So
Right.
there's a lot of things that doing that upfront investigation is worthwhile.
Yeah, and not to scare everyone, but lawyers are not lawyers, but people are very clever when it comes to trying to avoid paying things that they owe. We've seen situations where a business entity may be the actual customer, but any revenue or expense gets collected in another entity, a shell entity that they've set up, and then transferred over later. So what that means is that you may think you're doing business with one company, but that one company is a shell company and nothing ever goes through that. And you might end up being number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 on the debtor list when all the revenue is going somewhere else. So there's a lot of, if you don't know somebody, there's a lot of digging that you really need to do to make sure that you're going to get paid.
Mm-hmm.
That's
correct.
And a rule of thumb is cash on the barrel.
Yeah.
If you want me to do work for you, pay me up front.
Oh, yeah.
And that cures all.
Yeah. And, that is true. And that's definitely something that's suggested to a small business. But on the flip side, I do talk to some companies that, again, if you're wanting to grow, unfortunately, you've got to be able to manage being able to extend terms, because you're not going to get the bigger businesses on a COD basis.
Right.
So but again, if you do that, you can do it and still be successful if you do it correctly.
And the unfortunate thing about this is you can expend a lot of time and resources and then all of a sudden not get paid. And those can be big chunks when they do happen. And they may only be 5 or 6% of your revenue, but you're going to spend 30% of your time chasing it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really think long and hard about doing business with someone before you actually do it. Make sure you're going to get paid. Do you try to settle performance issues as well? Did you mention that up front?
Well, not really, because as far as like being the mediator, it's a matter of sometimes you need to get both sides of the story, first of all. But what I basically do in that aspect is I just relay the information, because I'm not in the place to make the judgment call, because I'm not familiar, with what actually occurred. It's between those two. But like I said, there's a lot of times when they don't want to communicate, or they're too angry and they don't want to deal with each other. So it's a matter of just trying to get the pieces, and then, okay, let's agree somewhere in the middle.
All right. So in those examples, how many of those did not communicate effectively up front with what the job entailed? The lion's share of them, half of them?
There's really only just a few that, could have been resolved, up front.
Because, I used to have a business where we performed these long projects for companies, and it was very specific in terms of here's what the deliverables are going to be, and here's when they occur, and here's when the payment's going to be. And I would just make sure to have ongoing progress meetings to make sure everybody was on schedule. So, know your customer up front, but then also communicate on these long jobs to make sure that you don't have a an issue and leave it floundering, because the longer you leave it floundering, the bigger problem it'll be down the road. You know, the old expression, kick the can down the road. You don't want to do that if it involves payment. Make sure everybody's up front and communicating as you go. And progress payments don't hurt either. You know, agreed upon progress payments. That way, you know, if there is a problem, if they don't, you know, that you haven't expended a lot of resource, but if they don't pay you the $5,000 for that first initial part of the work, then you know there's an issue. We need to sit down and talk about it.
Definitely, yes. Because I don't like getting in the middle of those. It'd be a lot easier for me if it was just cut and dry.
Those are called lawsuits most of the time. Yeah. So how does your company get paid these days? You do a percentage, you do a contractual amount, or how do you do that?
It depends on the service. So any real just basic debt collections themselves, if somebody turns an account over to me and says, please just collect this, I'm getting nowhere, you know, I'm basically at a standard 25%. And but it's different when it comes to accounts receivable outsourcing. That is a monthly contractual, and that's based on the number of accounts, not the dollar amount.
Okay.
You know, which I wish it was, because, you know, you collect a $10,000 invoice and I'm getting only what I get at the end of the month.
Sure.
On the contract. But, you know, so I try to keep it reasonable with what the service is and what they're needing done. And then even when it comes to filing judgments, I only ask the client to pay for the filing fees. So I don't take, you know, an extra bump on that, even if I have to drive to the courthouse, because it's typically no big deal.
Sure.
You know. But.
Well, I think the important thing for someone on the other side to know is that, and a lot of folks don't do this, unfortunately. They need to send the message that they're going to get paid, and they need to send that message pretty quickly. I dealt with a guy that had a consumer finance company, and he would call people 4 or 5 days before the due date, saying, your payment's coming up. Are you ready to make the payment? And so it became very obvious up front that this guy you weren't going to mess around with. And then if you did mess around with him, he told me one time that he spent $4,000 pursuing a $500 debt. And I said, why did you do that? He said, I didn't want the word to get around that I was easy. So he thought that the $5,000 would really help him in the long run, and it turned out it did. The word gets around that you don't mess with this particular company. You pay, or else he'll get the money from you one way or another. And the longer you wait to pay, the harder it's going to be.
Yes, that's always been a famous line.
Yeah. But if you do owe the money and someone like you calls, my suggestion would be to acknowledge the fact that you have the debt, and just be very open about the fact, whether you have an issue or not. If you don't have an issue, it's a question of, well, you got to get hey, the bank hasn't paid me yet, so I got to pay them, all those kinds of things. Be open. You can't put these things off. If you're a company that needs to make the payment, you can't put these things off, because the longer you put them off, the bigger the problem's going to be down the road. Because people like you, your job is to stay on it.
Yeah.
So how many times do you stop? Yeah, I guess you don't stop.
I don't.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if I've had some that I said this on a different radio show, but I've had some that were deceased. So I kind of, if there's no assets, there's nothing there to go after.
Well, I know, but
So
you're a creditor in probate, though. I mean, you can stand up while it's going. So it's pretty interesting. Well, listen, we've kind of run out of time, but I appreciate you being here. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. How to, as a banker, we lend money all the time, and we expect to get paid. And I think what I would want to impress on small businesses out there is, even though you think you're not a bank, you really are, because you're extending credit as much as I'm extending credit. I like what you said. Know your customer up front. Get the contract done up front. Put all of it in there. Make sure you're going to get paid for the people that are actually making the revenue, or the entity that's making the revenue, and everybody's committed to paying. And if somebody is a day late, they're still late. Call them. You're a day late. Make sure people know you're not going to be a pushover. There's all kinds of things that a small business can do, but I guess the most important thing is to realize that they're a bank, and they ought to stand up and act like a bank.
Oh, well, it's their money.
Yeah.
Do you want it?
Yeah,
Then protect it.
You've paid your wages, so you don't want to be on the hook for that. So, anything you want to add here at the end? How to get in touch with you? Some parting comments.
And yes, we also, we do provide a free consultation. So, again, depending on what this industry is and any issues that they're having, they can contact us by going to our website. First of all, it's on www.pccis.com. And we also have an email address on there and it's customer support at pccis.com. And so you can check out the website and get a full idea of what all services we do provide. And also I do training seminars too to help small businesses and what they can do initially within the business.
If I could add one thing here at the end, I would really recommend that a small business person, even if they're taking payments up front with credit cards, etc., I would highly recommend that you take advantage of a training seminar to find out what you're up against. Because, a consumer has 60 days to dispute a charge. So, that comes back to you as a merchant. You still got to go collect that money. So, I would highly recommend that they take some type of a training seminar just so they get a little flavor up front, some of the things they can do for the best practices before they start doing a lot of work for folks they don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Well, Dawn, thank you so much for being on the show, and hopefully 2016, I know you have to make money, but it'd be really a great world if people like you didn't have to spend as much time doing what you did. But it's going to be there. But anyway, well, hopefully 2016 will mean all your receivables get collected and you get paid your due, and it's going to be a bountiful year for everybody. So with that, this is Joe Moss, and you've been listening to On the Money, and brought to you by Embassy National Bank. Just to remind you, you can follow us on Twitter at @on_the_money, and then the number 1. So @_the_money, and then the number 1. You can listen to any of our episodes at onthemoney.businessradiox.com. We're also available to stream on iTunes for free, and you can also find us out under our video of the show, out under the YouTube channel of Business Radio X, Gwinnett Station, and look for On the Money. And as we say all the time here, and I think it's now more than ever to be appropriate, be careful out there. Make sure you know who you're doing business with so you can collect what you've worked so hard for. Leave fear in the back seat. Do everything right up front, so you try to put fear on the side. And then the other thing we talked about at the end of last year that we'll continue to talk about, I think it's very important, is stay authentic. Be yourself. People really want to do business with you, not somebody you're pretending to be. So with that, thanks, and we'll see you on the next chapter of On the Money.